Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. Today I'm going to be doing a complete disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Mega Cycloneshock. We will of course first take a look at the controls. In its normal position, the trigger is not locked, the cylinder can rotate freely. When you prime it back, while it's primed back, the trigger is locked and the cylinder is locked. Now this usually doesn't come up much because it does have a spring-loaded slide return, and so it's not like many of the other blasters where, slide primed blasters, where the slide stays back and you have to manually push it forward. And so they have those locks in place so you don't pull the trigger while the slide is back. Now you technically could with this, but it doesn't work. Now if you pull the trigger and then operate the slide, it won't catch. You have to release the trigger before it will catch. And then it will fire. And this one, the seal is good enough that the plunger is taking a while to actually go forward, which is causing the cylinder to not unlock immediately. But when you're firing it, it will. So let's get this thing open and take a look at it. There are a number of different sized screws, and we're going to take them out first. Here at the top of the slide, there is one very small screw that may well require you to use a smaller screwdriver. I have to for it, but it's the only one of its size, and it's right here at the top. Get it out. We then have a number of larger screws. There's one up here right above the muzzle, which is common. No, that is the right screwdriver. It is common for that screw to be one of the long ones. There is then also a long screw here at the bottom back of the slide. And then there is one more long one, but we have to take out a few regular sized ones first. Now, remember, when you're taking out screws, especially for the first time, be sure to apply plenty of pressure and give it one quick sharp twist to break the seal on the screw. After that, they should go in and out fairly easily, but that first time is kind of the critical one. If you're going to end up accidentally stripping out your screw, the screw head, it'll probably be that first time you go to take it out. We can now take the slide apart. There is a tension spring, extension spring that is attached to it, but it does just come off easily. And now we have access to our last long screw here at the back of the slide, which is also a common place to have it because it is a fairly load-bearing section. So those are our three unusual ones, where all of the rest of them are the same. Now, on some models of Cycloneshocks, I opened up two of them recently, and one didn't have this, and this one does. Apparently, at some point, they decided they could, I assume, save some money by eliminating a number of screws. So they determined which screws were not actually necessary for structural integrity, and they got rid of them and just replaced them with a fake screw that's just molded in. So they are the ones that are fake on this model are right here in the handle, and I actually tried to remove that screw thinking it was one and tore the head up. There is another fake screw here at the bottom corner and here right above the slide. They are not actually screws. You cannot remove them. Don't try. But, like I said, not all models had that, so you will need to check. But if you're having issues, take a look, and if it's not a black screw head, if it's just red or dark gray, then it's probably one where they have eliminated those screws. Alright, we should be able to get in now. It does tend to be a little sticky up here at the front. That'll be the part that might not want to open up, and then we should be able to get in. There aren't too many things that are likely to spring, too many springs that are likely to pop. Most of the springs in here are actually captive, which is nice. But we can take our entire trigger group out. This has a trigger group assembly that has the catch as well as the trigger lock built into it. We will be looking at that closer and how it works. There is then this loose piece here that's not actually held in by anything. This is part of the trigger lock. If you simply remove it without removing any other parts of the trigger lock, the trigger will be permanently locked. This is the part that actually unlocks it, so we'll take a look at that. We do have our slide return spring. This whole assembly then comes out, and we will take a closer look at some of the parts involved there. And And then we have this little spring-loaded tab right here. The spring is captive, but do be careful. Springs do like to spring. We have the muzzle and rail that can potentially come out. Yeah, it can. Maybe. There we go. This looks to be solvent welded together, and I can't imagine why you would want to take it out. It's got the rail nubbin is locked in there. And then we have the two sides of the shell, which actually do come apart easily enough. But that's not really necessary for this part. It does make painting really, really easy, and it's really nice. They're not even clipped in. It's a better time. Okay, let's take a look at those other assemblies. We'll first take a look at our plunger and rotation mech assembly. The plunger tube comes out, and it does have the collapsing plunger rod, which is what allows the slide to return. You have to have some sort of a mechanism that allows that to happen in order for the slide to return, and this thing could definitely use some lubricant. We then have our rotation mech assembly, which the plunger can slide, as most of them do. There isn't a spring, though. It looks like there should be a spring, but that apparently is another cost-cutting measure they decided they didn't actually need. For whatever reason. This one doesn't really need it as much as, say, the strong arm does, because the cylinder doesn't need to rotate freely. It is forced to rotate by the prime, and so even if this is forward, it will still rotate, unlike the strong arm. This whole assembly also appears to be solvent welded together. It doesn't look like it's clipped. It doesn't look like there are any screws. So I recommend not trying to take the rotation mech out. Obviously you can just pull the cylinder off if you want to use that for something, or if you want to replace the cylinder with, say, a shotgun cylinder or something. It's a 6-round rotation, and it doesn't matter. Whichever way it fits on there, it will work. So this back part is spring-loaded, and also appears to be solvent welded and captive, so there's really nothing to take apart there. Let's take a look at the trigger mech, and for this we will zoom in. So this is a fairly key part, and there are a number of moving parts that can get lost or can have problems. It's all clipped together, so pop the clips on the back and it will open up. And there are a number of parts in here. Obviously we have our trigger and its spring, which is, as I mentioned, fairly captive, which is nice. And then this part here, which vaguely resembles a lock of some kind, is actually the catch. And it also has a spring that is fairly captive, not a wonderful captive system, but it does keep the spring from wandering off too much. And that can then come out. And then finally, on the other side of the cap, we have another moving part. And this is, in fact, the trigger lock. When this is in position on there, it prevents you from being able to pull the trigger unless this button has been pressed. And it is pressed by that little knob, and I'll show how all of that works when we go to reassemble. But that is your trigger lock, and it prevents you from pulling the trigger if the slide is not all the way forward. It is also captive and solvent welded by this cap here, which is fairly easy to remove. I was able to just do it by hand. There was just a little bit of solvent weld right there. I believe when this is actually in the blaster, it is held closed by the far side of the shell, though you might want to glue that in. If you're going to remove this part, because in here we just have a fairly light spring and what actually is a lock. If you want to remove the trigger lock altogether so that you can deprime the blaster, you'll need to pop that little cap off and remove that part. And at which point you don't need to put the little cap back on, though there's no reason really not to, just for structural. It might actually be partly necessary in holding parts in place to have that cap on there. I'm not sure. Alright, we are now ready to start reassembling, and we're going to start with that trigger mechanism. And we're going to start with this part, which is part of the housing. And this is the part that houses the catch and the trigger itself. So the catch is this part. And it goes in right here so that the angle is that way. It will only fit in one direction. So it goes right there. Careful of springage, of course. And then our trigger simply goes in on top of it right there, and it should in fact line up with the part of that, and that those two angled surfaces are of course what causes the catch to get pushed down when you pull the trigger. Now the trigger lock is on the other side, so we'll set this aside and take a look at the other side, which is this is the top part. And into this little cavity we are going to put our trigger lock, which is this part. And again, there's only one way that it can go in there. There is a notch on the side of this that matches up with a notch in there. So you simply drop it in. We're then going to use the very light spring, and this is the one non-captive spring that is easy to lose. So it's simply going to lie on there. There isn't anything that holds it in place. It just sits on the top. And then finally we take our cap, and it's going to go right on the top there. And if you have in fact taken that off and you want the trigger lock to still be assembled, I highly recommend gluing that in place so that it doesn't pop loose inside. Like I said, I don't know if it can. It might be held in place by the shell, but you're better off safe than sorry. This then simply goes on top of there. It will, again, will only fit in one direction, and it will clip in place. Drain! Alright, so that is our full trigger assembly reassembled. Now, as I mentioned, in its current state, it is locked. The trigger is locked. I cannot pull the trigger because of that white tab that's popping up and locking the trigger. If we take this part, which is the other part of the trigger lock, it's kind of the key. It's what unlocks the trigger. And we put it in here. There is an angled surface right there that goes into that slot, and when it gets pulled forward, it unlocks the trigger. And now we can actually pull the trigger and the catch will release. If you want to disable the trigger lock, the part you actually need to remove is that inner part, the part that's in the trigger assembly. You could leave this part in, it won't do anything anymore, but if you only remove this part, your trigger will be permanently locked. So, alright, let's start putting the stuff back in the shell. Alright, the first part we're going to install is actually going to be the top rail and muzzle. We will have to finagle a part in under it a little bit later, but it's a lot easier to put it in first. The next part we're going to be putting in is this part. This little lever tab thing, and it goes in on a little post right here, right between where the handle meets the back of the plastic. There's a little tab that it sits on. And the spring needs to be pointing up, like so. And we will be discussing what exactly that is when we install the next part, which is going to be the entire plunger tube, plunger rod assembly. The plunger rod simply goes in there. There is no up or down with it, as far as I know. It simply goes inside there. I highly recommend, while you're in the blaster, though, to add a little bit of lubricant to various moving parts, including that. Put some lubricant on your O-ring. I also actually recommend that you lubricate any of the angled surfaces that are going to be making contact with any other angled surfaces. They need to be able to slide over each other smoothly, and if they get caught up on each other because of too much friction or grit or dirt, they won't work. So there is an angled surface on that little spring-loaded tab we installed, and there's an angled surface on this spring-loaded tab on the back of the rotation mech arm. And I recommend you clean those and probably lubricate them as well. Possibly even lubricate the whole thing so that it can move freely, because a fair number of parts in here are friction-based and don't actually have anything that really forces them as well as they should. And so making sure that everything is clean and lubricated is very important with this particular blaster. The next part that we're going to be putting in is this. That trigger lock key, as it were, and it's going to go right here on the top of our rotation mech arm, right below the plunger. There is a slot that it fits in. There is an angled surface right there. The part that actually unlocks the trigger needs to be pointing up and towards the back. And again, it needs to be able to move freely. And this is another one that I recommend adding a little bit of lubricant on, because this part isn't as well, it's not forced as well to go in the directions that it needs to go as it could be. And having a little bit too much grit or whatever might actually prevent it from moving, which might then not unlock your trigger. Or might not lock your trigger, depending on which way things are moving. Alright, the next part we're going to put in is our trigger assembly. And it is simply going to go in on top, on there. It doesn't actually matter what position that unlock is in, because it will get forced into the right position by the slide as soon as we put it in. The next part we're going to put in is our return spring, which just goes on this post right above the plunger rod. And then finally we can put the far side of the slide in place. This isn't actually when we're going to attach this, but this will allow us to now manually operate the blaster and show how everything works. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the plunger rod out so I don't have spring tension while I operate everything. I'm also not going to attach the slide return spring so that we can see how everything in here moves. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see how the action is working. Alright, now that we have everything in, I'm going to attempt to cycle it and show you how everything works. Now, a lot of these parts are actually properly held in place by the other side of the shell, and so it can be a little bit finicky, so bear with me. We'll see if we can get this work. I've taken out the plunger so we don't have that spring, and I've disabled that spring so that it's not under tension, and I should be able to cycle it. As you start to move the slide back, the first thing that it does, in addition to starting to pull back on the plunger rod, is lock the trigger. So you can see there that the trigger lock mechanism is getting pulled back. That has now locked our trigger, and we cannot pull the trigger. It will get forced forward again as the slide goes forward. So it goes forward, and then it unhooks, and then as it comes forward, it unlocks it for you. So that is how that works. As the slide continues back, after it's locked it, nothing happens for a while until it gets far enough back and it picks up the rotation on the slide. The slide has a notch that hooks on this spring-loaded tab right here. This is spring-loaded, and when it's up, it will catch the slide. So the slide catches it and pulls it back, and that is what, as it continues to go back, will eventually, as you can see, cause the cylinder to rotate. When it gets far enough back, the angled surface here on the back of the grip and the angled surface on the top of that tab that the slide is catching will interact, and it will force that tab down. And then this little lock, that little spring-loaded lock, will lock it in place. So that is now locked down as this continues back. This is important because we need the slide to be able to move freely, and right now, with that tab locked down, it's not engaging the slide at all anymore. And the slide can start to freely move forward when you let go of the slide under the spring tension of that return spring, and it will force it forward. As it starts coming forward, an angled surface on the slide will force that little tab, that little lock, up, as you can see there. And that unlocks the link, and as the arm continues forward, it will then pick up the link and return it to its starting position, so that it can then be picked up again when you cycle it back. So that little tab is in fact important. It's not a lock that prevents you from doing anything. It is a lock that allows the slide to move freely, which it needs to do. So that is not something you want to remove. The only lock that you would ever want to remove would be the trigger lock, which would then allow you to deprime the blaster. You can pull the slide back, pull the trigger, and then slowly let the slide go forward so that you don't have to dry fire it or what have you. But you would need to remove the part that is under this little cap. Just removing that little sliding part there will result in the trigger being permanently locked. So you need to remove, I would recommend, if you're going to remove one, remove both. But you have to remove the little tab that's under here and its spring. That is in fact all there is to it. We can now put our plunger back in and hopefully manage to not spoil anything. We seem to have done so. Alright, the last part that needs to go on is the slide on the far side of the blaster, and I'm going to show it here in additional detail because there's a very important bit of alignment that has to be done just right, or you'll end up having your slide get locked and it won't prime and you'll get very frustrated and you won't understand why. We're going to put the slide underneath, and you need to make sure that obviously the plunger rod is hooking on it, so when you pull it back the plunger rod moves. That is the key element. There is a return spring. It hooks on the middle of the 3 posts that are on here, and then it gets pulled forward and hooked on the post that's directly, or you could go from the forward back, whichever works best for you. But the key element is that little tab, and I'm going to zoom in real close so you can see what's going on here. This tab is currently not in the correct position. It is not, it's extended, and it needs to be pushed up. And that'll only hold in that position if the slide is on and you are supporting the back of the slide. Zoom out a little bit. You need to be supporting the slide so that it is flush with the shell. If the slide, and we'll zoom back in for this, we'll zoom back in. If the slide goes down a little bit, that'll pop loose. And then when you put the shell together, it'll end up getting pinched by the shell and it won't allow this part to move back, and it'll end up locking your slide. So that needs to get pushed up so that it is fully compressed. And now, with your hand supporting the slide, so you're just letting gravity do the work, but you're supporting the back of the slide, now we're going to put the other side of the shell on, and we need to make very sure that that doesn't pop loose when you put the shell on. So I recommend starting with the back. You're going to put the back of the shell on and then rock it forward, and it should all slide into place. And that way, that little section ends up aligned correctly. Alright, we can now start putting in some screws. I'm going to continue to support the back of that slide to make sure nothing pops loose, though it shouldn't at this point. But just to be safe, I'm going to put in a screw while I'm still holding that in. And I'm going to put in this center screw right in the middle of the blaster, right in front of the trigger, because it should help hold the whole shell together so nothing should come out. It's a normal sized screw, one of the ones that we've got lots of. And remember, when you put in the screws back in, always rotate counterclockwise until you hear it click. That is the thread on the screw aligning with the thread in the screw post. And if you don't do that, you run the risk of what's called cross-threading, where the thread isn't aligned and you're basically using the screw like a drill to drill new thread. And that will chew up the existing thread, and eventually there won't be enough material left for the screw to even hold on to, and it won't hold the shell together anymore. We're now going to put in our long screws. We had 3 long screws. The first one is going to go here, underneath where the slide will eventually be. It's the lower of the 2 screw posts that are under the slide. So that's our first long screw. The second one is up here right above the muzzle. We then have another regular sized screw right here that's also going to be underneath the slide, so we need to put that one in before we put the rest of the slide on. Finally, we can put the slide on. You may need to adjust that plunger rod, because if it gets twisted down, it won't want to pop in, so just push it up, and then you should be able to get this to align. And the last of our long screws goes in the back bottom corner. We then have our one really small screw that also goes here on the top of the slide. You will probably need a smaller screwdriver because it is tiny. And kind of odd and out of place, honestly. Then all the rest of the screws are standard, so it doesn't matter where they go. Remember, depending on the version you have, if you have the version that has fake screw holes, it's the one right here on the grip, this one right below the rail, and this one right below the cylinder. Those ones are not, in fact, screw posts on newer models, so you don't need to put a screw in there, and if you try to, it's not going to go in and you're going to be terribly confused. I wouldn't know anything about that. I've definitely never accidentally tried to remove one of those screws only to discover it wasn't a screw. Alright, so we have it fully reassembled. Let's check all of the controls again. The trigger is unlocked when the slide is forward. The cylinder is unlocked. It will prime back and it will catch. The cylinder locks. The trigger locks. It slides forward and it fires. If we are holding the trigger when we go back, it will not catch. But if we let go of the trigger, it will, and it will slide. And sure enough, so that is the full disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Mega Cycloneshock. I know this one wasn't, I don't think this one was even on the survey. This one came up as kind of an emergency one for somebody who was having trouble reassembling their Cycloneshock on Facebook. I came out here to disassemble one to try to work them through it, and I figured as long as I'm out here, I might as well do this video. So the survey for what blasters you would like to see will of course still be down in the description, and I will go back to pulling blasters from that starting probably next week. If not, possibly I might do another one this week just to make up for this one. So hopefully this was helpful to someone out there, and thank you guys for watching.